he works with a lot of nuisance wildlife, but his real claim to fame is bobcats. And so Jim has been working with doing long-term ecological research with bobcats and doing some really, really good work. He's a great all-around biologist. But I met Jim about 20 years ago, and I was at Kiawah. I know this isn't about me, but I'm just going to tell the story. So,
it's always about
no, it's not. Anyway, so I was helping Kiawah do some education stuff on the island there, and Jim invited me out in the field with him, and he had located a Bobcat Den, and he let me hold a baby bobcat. And that is one of the great moments, nature moments of my life. So I owe that to Jim. Anyway, Jim, we're thrilled to have you. Not only is he going to teach us about South Carolina bobcats, but also about maybe a little bit about bobcats that live right here in Spring Island. Boy, thank you, Jim.
All right. Let's see. Make sure.
Is that good right there, you think?
Yeah, that should be fine. All right, how are we doing on sound? I need the mic, probably? Okay. All right, so we'll go with the mic. Thank y'all for having me. Pleasure to be back here. I haven't been to Spring Island in almost 20 years. Doesn't look a whole lot different, honestly. Still a pretty place, but I haven't been around very much. All right, so we'll get started. You know, like Tony said, I work at Kiawah, and I'm sure most of you probably know where Kiawah is, but I always start off just kind of showing where we're doing this work. So Kiawah is right here, coastal barrier island, about 20 miles from Charleston, South Carolina. And so it's a gated residential resort community. We're about 8,000 total acres of land. About 3,000 of that is coastal salt marsh and about 5,000 upland acres. We have 5 golf courses. We have 1,762 permanent residents, approximately. We got over 3,300 developed lots on the island and only 400 single-family lots still to be built on. So we're pretty much at build-out now, with a few exceptions. So wildlife management on Kiawah, so I'm a biologist for the town. We actually have 2 full-time biologists that work for the town of Kiawah, which is pretty unusual to have a municipality with a single biologist, much less 2. So it's a nice place to work, and we get to do a lot of fun stuff. So we do wildlife population surveys, as Tony said, nuisance wildlife, outreach and education as well. But our favorite thing is our research, and we spend probably half of our jobs are spent doing research on the island. And so before we get to, why you're all here to talk about bobcats, when we're trying to figure out what animals to do research on, it's a challenge because there are lots of things that live out there. So we tend to focus on 2 different groups of species. These are keystone and indicator species. So a keystone species is going to be typically at the top of the food chain. Doesn't have to be, but they're pretty vital for the health of the ecosystem of that area. Without them, the ecosystem probably isn't going to do too great. And also they can change habitat. And so that's how deer are a keystone species, because if they go out into a forest and they eat every little oak sapling out there, then you don't have oak trees 50 years later, right? So they are altering the environment and changing the ecosystem. And bobcats do that as well, and we'll talk about how they do that. The other group of species that we like to focus on are indicator species. So these we use to monitor environmental changes, to look at how our management is working out, and they also help us know if we've got problems in certain types of habitats. So for example, with marsh sparrows, they live in the coastal salt marsh. They are vulnerable to sea level rise, climate change. And so by studying them, we can get an idea of if we have potential issues coming. So we'll move on to bobcats. I know that's why you're all here. So bobcats are about twice the size of a domestic cat. Depends on the size of your cat. Some are bigger than others. But across their range, bobcats, an adult male will weigh anywhere from 12 to 68 pounds. At Kiawah, our adult males tend to be between 20 and 28, with probably 22, 23 being the average. Females across their range, 9 to 34 pounds. At Kiawah, 14 to 20. They breed in February and April. Kittens are born about 2 months later. They typically have 1 to 3 kittens, but we have seen up to 5. They are solitary, so normally if you see a bobcat, it's going to be 1. But during the breeding season, females will be with males for a short period of time, And then the females will stay with their kittens for almost a year. So if you see a group of bobcats, it's probably a female with her kittens from that same year. They're a visual predator. They don't rely on their sense of smell a whole lot. They're really good at picking up movement. And so that's how they find their prey primarily. And so they eat rodents, rabbits, birds, and deer. Males are territorial. Females are to some extent, but their territories will overlap. And so to talk about bobcats actually on Kiawah, we've got about 30 to 35 cats on the island. We know from doing food habit studies, so looking at their scat, we have a pretty good idea on what they eat throughout the year. Year-round, the majority of their diet are rodents. So this would be things like cotton rats, gray squirrels, that sort of thing. And then during the spring, at least at Kiawah, and a lot of places, they focus on deer, and that's going to be deer fawns. And we'll talk a little bit about some research we've done with deer and bobcats. And then in the wintertime is about the only time we see birds show up in their diet. We don't know exactly why that is. It could be that it's migrant birds that have moved into the area that are making mistakes. So the bobcats can catch them a little easier. But that's typically when we see birds show up. And so the average home range size of a bobcat, at least at Kiawah, is about, for an adult male, is almost 2,000 acres. We've had some as few as 1,000 and some as much as 3,000. For females, 800 is the average at Kiawah, but again, we've had some as low as 500 and some over 1,000. And so at Kiawah, bobcats are really an iconic species. Our residents love these guys. We certainly focus, a lot of our land preservation is focused with the goal of helping bobcats. So we really utilize the bobcat as kind of our ambassador for preserving land, enhancing habitat, that sort of thing. So talk a little bit about the research that we've done in the past and kind of lead up to the current bobcat research. So I started doing my work at Kiawah in 1996, and it was my graduate project. And my job was basically to figure out, well, the issue was deer. They had a lot of deer, and so they wanted to know, okay, how many deer do we have? What's going on with deer? Is anything eating deer? Kind of what's going on the island ecologically. And so we figured out, okay, bobcats are definitely eating deer. So they're important to the island. So let's start studying them. So the first study we did was in 2000. We had a graduate student from the University of Georgia. We caught 12 bobcats. We did it again in 2004 and 2005, where we put VHF collars on 16 bobcats and also 5 gray foxes. And then we tracked them in each of those studies. We tracked these bobcats for a year. And basically we're trying to figure out, okay, how big of an area do they live in? What type of habitat are they spending their time in? How many are dying? Are they leaving the island? Are they coming onto the island? And then where are they having their kittens? So I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with how VHF telemetry works, but it's very labor intensive. So the animal's wearing a collar that is beeping on a specific frequency, but obviously you can only hear it if you're out in the field and you're dialed into that frequency. And so basically, to get a location for an animal, you've got to be in the field when you want that location. So if that's 2 in the morning, you got to be out there at 2 in the morning. And so to figure out where that animal is, you got to go to 3 different spots and basically take bearings and put it on a map and draw it out, and it takes a long time to get a single location. So luckily we're past that, and with the arrival of GPS, it makes our lives a lot easier. But before we get to the GPS work, touch on one other study that we did, and this one was in 2002 to 2005. And so we were catching fawns the day they were born, typically within 6 hours of birth, and we were putting little tiny radio collars on them. And these collars would expand as the fawn grew up, and ultimately they'd fall off. So we were tracking them as soon as we put it on there, and what we found is that bobcats killed 70% of our fawns. So 56% of them, and almost all of those happened in the first 2 weeks. So if a fawn on Kiawah made it to 2 weeks old, chances were that a bobcat was not going to catch it. Other things would. We'd have alligators get them occasionally. They'd get hit by cars, a few other things. But bobcats were really doing a good job controlling our deer numbers. And the other thing we noticed, because we were tracking bobcats at the same time we were tracking these fawns, is that certain bobcats were really good at catching fawns, and some bobcats we never found near a fawn, a site where a fawn was killed. So for example, in one year we had one male bobcat that we had a collar on, and in his home range area, of all the fawns we had in that area, he ate half of them. Just him. So you've got certain bobcats that they've figured it out, and they change how they're searching for prey during this time of year. So they can make a really big difference. And actually the next year, that bobcat died, got hit by a car, and the fawn survival in that area went up substantially. So long story short, the effect of bobcats, and we did a little bit of fertility control work at Kiawah in the late 90s, but our deer numbers have been pretty stable for a while, to the point where we haven't had to do any sort of deer management. We don't have hunts or anything like that, haven't since the late 90s. We'll talk about what's going on right now here at the end. I'll kind of keep you in suspense on that one. So real quick, so here we go into our GPS work. We started that in 2007, and we've done it every year since then. So we're still trapping bobcats every winter. We typically trap for about 2 months. And during the course of the study, we put GPS collars on 83 bobcats, 45 females and 38 males. And so as I talked about VHF, right, you've got to be out in the field to figure out where these cats are. Well, with GPS, you don't. In the early years, we would have to go out once a month and download the data wirelessly from the collars. And then about 6 years ago, the technology got so good that the collars would send us a text message every day telling us where they had been, where that bobcat had been for the previous day. And now what our collars do is they actually use a satellite network called the Iridium network. And so they basically are uploading their data almost in real time, and then it's coming down to us. So makes it easy, once you catch them, you can pretty much just sit in the office and the data just kind of rolls in. But it gives you a lot of data to analyze. So we've collected more than 100,000 locations for bobcats just on Kiawah since 2007. And so what do we do with all that data? Well, we look for patterns and habitat use, day versus night, denning sites, some of the stuff I already mentioned before. So before we get into kind of the data and what we're learning, I thought I'd show you how we catch our bobcats. So we use a standard, predator type trap, a cage trap. It's got a little trap, it's got a little pan in the back. So we actually take these traps and we modify them by building a special compartment on the back. We use a Bantam rooster. He gets food and water every day. We've caught almost 150 bobcats in these traps. We've never had one eat one of our roosters. And I love roosters. My kids love chickens, so we're not torturing these roosters. They are a little traumatized the next morning when you show up. So at the end of the year, we give them away to some folks, and these are going to farms where they run around and have a good time. So anyway, so the bobcat goes in the trap. Obviously the trap closes, and then we'll come and we'll put the bobcat to sleep. Just use a hand syringe after we pin the cat to the back of the trap. And then once they're asleep, we'll take some measurements real quick. We'll put the collar on them, and then we get to let them go, which is one of the better parts of the job. Let's see if this will work. So here's me letting one go. So he's coming out of there. I got another one though, hold on. So how to release a bobcat, take 2 here.
Oh my, look at that. Isn't that beautiful?
That's a good one, right? I like those. So as I said, we've caught over 100 bobcats. And for the last 5 years, I've been taking my iPhone and putting it down in front of the traps and trying to get footage like that. So I've gotten it, it's worked like 4 times out of 100. So it doesn't always work because you think you know where they're going to go. I mean, sometimes we'll turn the trap so there's a trail for them to go down, and they just turn and go the other way. So, all right, so let's talk about the data and kind of what we do with it. And so I thought I'd start with just generally where do bobcats go and where do they go during the day. And so we took Kiawah and we divided it up into different habitat types, and I'll show you a map here in just a minute. But the take-home message is that during the day, most of our bobcats spend most of their time in what we identified as scrub-shrub habitat. So that is low brushy cover, typically less than, the canopy is 10 or 15 feet high. And so at Kiawah, you're going to find that typically in the secondary dunes, on the marsh edge, right? You're not going to find it in a forest. So then that's during the day. They also spend a good bit of time in the forest during the day as well. But at night, that changes a pretty good bit. They're still utilizing this scrub-shrub habitat. Their use of forest goes up a little bit, and their use of developed properties goes up a lot. And their use of roadways goes up a lot. And so when we look at the map, I'll explain that a little bit. But basically, they're not obviously walking down the paved road. When we set basically the habitat zone for road, we included the easements on the side of the road, and in a lot of cases, those are vegetated with pretty dense cover. And so these cats are using the roadway systems to move around the island, and we'll look at some of that. So we'll start with. This is one of the earlier cats that we caught, and so this blue line here is her home range. So this is the area she lives in. And again, I talked about our different types of habitats. So purple is going to be a developed lot. Blue is going to be our roadway. Green is forest. Red is our scrub shrub, like I said. And then yellow is tidal marsh. And so again, all of our scrub shrub habitat is down here by the ocean. This is the ocean down here. And then we've got a little bit up here on the marsh edge. And so we're going to look at all the points for this cat during daytime hours. Okay, so if you can see them all, this is her big home range where she lives. But during the day, this is one cat. One cat over the course of a month. And so no surprise, she's down here in the dunes. And so let's zoom in a little further and kind of look at that. And it's probably easier to see if I take that off, but right, so this is beachfront. You've got multi-million-dollar homes here, but you've got really good daytime cover for bobcats, and you've got boardwalks going throughout this area. In a lot of cases, these cats are actually underneath the boardwalks because it's nice and shady under there. And so a lot of times, right, we've got folks going to the beach that have no idea they're walking, 5 or 10 feet from a bobcat, or there could be a bobcat literally underneath the boardwalk. So let's go back. We looked at daytime points. Probably no surprise what's going to happen when I change it and show you nighttime points. So that's where she is at night. And again, I talked about road corridors. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Kiawah, maybe not too many, but this is Flyway Drive, and it's a pretty big road. And on this side of Flyway Drive is a leisure trail system, and it's very heavily vegetated. It's called the Alley of Oaks. And so this cat literally spent a lot of times, that is how she would get from her daytime cover up here to the marshy area, where she would spend a lot of her time at night. So utilizing these road corridors, she could travel basically, with a few exceptions, from down here, staying in cover completely until she got up here, and then she can hunt and feed in the yards and the buffers between the yards. How am I doing on time? All right, we're good. All right, so I still got a pretty good bit to cover. So let's look at real quick, it's kind of neat. So obviously, we've collected all this data on these cats. We've looked at habitat use. But we also want to look at, okay, well, how big of an area do they live in? It talked about how males are territorial, so we'll look at that a little bit. So here's one of our males. He's got a 3,000 acre home range, lives on the western end of Kiawah. Same year, so this is adult male 30, smaller home range. but pretty much he's not overlapping at all with male 70. So when we're drawing these home ranges, they put a little bit of a buffer into it. But pretty much these cats do not go into each other's territories, with one exception. So you'll notice a few points over here and a few points over here. Anybody want to guess what time of year that is? February. The month of February, all bets are off. So these guys will typically venture into the neighboring male's territory looking for females. Sometimes they'll just spend a couple of days over there, sometimes a little bit longer. But other than that, you could literally, their territories are, they're very well defined, and they really don't break those borders. So we'll add another one on here. Adult male 110, again, not much overlap. And then I'm going to throw a curveball at him. We had a fourth male that year. He had a 7,000 acre home range. So he's overlapping everybody. And so what we call these males, so we see this with juveniles a fair amount, but when you get an adult male that has a very large home range like that, we call those transient males. So he's probably a younger male that hasn't established a territory. So he's looking around. And what these animals tend to do, so what he would do would be he would set up in male 70's home range for about 2 weeks. And then something would probably happen, and then he'd leave. And he'd go over here for 3-4 weeks. And then he'd go up here. So he's constantly moving around, looking for a territory to open up so he can fill it. But in the meantime, he's covering a lot of ground to do that. And so we'll look at, let's see. So we'll look at females, right? And as I told you, they've got substantially smaller home ranges. And we do see a fair amount of overlap with our females. So we'll have females. Typically they're related. So we've got a pretty good idea because we've been doing this so long that we know. So I'll talk about when I get to the kitten section, but basically every time we catch a bobcat, whether we put a collar on it or not, we're giving it a pit tag. So that would be just like your dog or cat would get at the vet's office so that it can be scanned and identified if it ever gets lost. So all the bobcats that we catch on Kiawah get a pit tag. And that would be kittens, juveniles, adults. And so over time, when we're catching these animals that we caught as kittens, right, we would know who the mother was because we had her collared in order to find the den. And so a lot of times when we see our females overlap, it's because they're related. It's either mother-daughter, or even further down the line. So real quick, show up females. Obviously, you've got territorial males. For Kiawah, we can probably only hold 3, 4, 5 dominant adult males with the amount of habitat we have. With females, obviously, you've got more of them because they're utilizing a smaller amount of habitat. Another neat thing we can look at, and this is one of the big focuses of the research and why we've kept it going so long, was that we wanted to be able to see long-term changes as more homes are built, more land is cleared. What are the bobcats doing? How are they adapting? Do they have to move further to find what they need every time, every couple of years because there's less and less habitat? And so we've been fortunate in a few cases to catch cats multiple times. So normally these collars last about a year, but we're catching every year. And sometimes we catch the same animal multiple times. So we've got a case here of a female that lives on the eastern end of Kiawah. And we actually caught her 3 times in a 4-year span. And so it's neat to kind of look at, okay, there was a fair amount of building going on in this area. Did anything change over those 4 years? So here's her home range in 2008. We'll zoom in on it a little bit. Here she is in 2010. Pretty much the exact same home range. 2012, pretty much the same home range. So in the course of 4 years, she pretty much was, stayed put, really didn't expand her range at all. And stayed in the same area. We tend to see that with our females. And so got another example here of a male that we had 2 years in a row. So this is Bobcat 70. So this was, yellow was his home range in 2009, and then blue is 2010. So as you can see, he expanded his home range actually off of Kiawah. This is the Kiawah Island Bridge right here. So once he crosses that, he's actually on Seabrook Island. And we've had cats go a lot further than that. But The interesting thing here is that we knew why he did this, why he expanded his range. And what we knew was that in 2009, we had another male, Bobcat 50, and his home range ran up to the bridge. Well, he died in the end of 2009, and within 3 days, this bobcat had expanded his home range over here, and he started utilizing a portion of that habitat. So that tells you how cued in they are to these territories, these males, right? They know where the other one lives, and they know when they're not there, and when that territory is available for them to move into.
How did he die?
Got hit by a car. On Kiawah, up until recently, if a bobcat was going to die, it was going to be from a vehicle collision. But we've got a new issue now, which I'm going to talk about. So here's another fun cat, and I got 2 of these where, cats that moved a pretty good distance. So we'll actually go to the next slide here. Okay, so this is Kiawah. This is the Kiawah Island Bridge. This is Seabrook Island. Once you get up here to Hallover Creek right here, this is John's Island. So from here to here is about 7 miles. Okay, so this Bobcat 138 in 1 week. We're going to go through 7 days with this cat. Okay, so that's day 1. So day 1, he starts at the tip of Seabrook Island in some really good bobcat habitat. And he goes up here through some marginal bobcat habitat, up here to some great bobcat habitat. And then he spends day 2 up there. Day 3, he's back to Kiawah, which is where we caught him, which is where we thought he lived, which is why we put a collar on him. So he comes back to Kiawah on day 3. Day 4, he's going to spend it at Kiawah. Day 5, he goes out to the spit on the western end of Kiawah, decides, I'm going to go back to Seabrook. So he runs across the bridge again, all the way back to this cover down here on Seabrook. The next day, he decided, well, better go back to Kiawah. So again, across the bridge, right? It's a 2-lane bridge, right? He's running across it almost 3 nights in a row, 3 out of 4 nights. And then the next day, I'm not sure what he's doing, but he leaves Kiawah again, thinks he's going to Seabrook, changes his mind and goes to John's Island. So the interesting thing here, not only did he move a lot, and this isn't typical, but where he was utilizing habitat that was really good in areas that were pretty far apart. So in an area like most of Kiawah where we've got a lot of good habitat, right, these cats aren't having to jump and find good habitat. But in this case, probably he's another one of those transient males. He's investigating good habitat, looking for a territory, but always like showing that one. So this is one from last year. This is an adult male. And this is close to the furthest we've had one go. We've had one go to Edisto, and we had one end up in Green Pond a number of years ago. But this was a male who, we joke, it was 2 days after July 4th. There was it was pretty crowded on Kiawah. Fireworks are loud. So he decides, I'm out of here. So heads across the bridge on July 6th, swims across Bohicket Creek here, which is it's probably 100 yards across at that point. Goes up on Wadmalaw, hits the intercoastal here, decides he doesn't want to cross it. So he works his way all the way up here. I don't know, I'm sure a lot of you go to Charleston from time to time. So this is where Main Road hits Highway 17. There's a Burger King there as you're heading into Charleston. So he stops just on the Johns Island side of the Intercoastal Waterway. And in some really good bobcat habitat. There's a little patch of great scrub shrub habitat right there almost underneath the Limehouse Bridge. And so he stays there for a little bit, and then he gets brave enough to cross the Intercoastal. And I know there's a lot of dots here, but then he decides, well, I've already crossed the Intercoastal, I might as well cross Highway 17. So he does that and spends a fair amount of time up here. So between August and December of 2018, he swims the Intercoastal Waterway 11 times. He crosses Highway 17 11 times. And actually we live over here in this subdivision, and he got pretty close to my house, which is almost 20 miles from where I caught him. So kind of crazy, but just goes to show you that bobcats can certainly be anywhere. So we'll move on and talk a little bit about Bobcat Dens. And so over the years, every time we've got a female with a GPS collar, one of our big goals is to figure out if she's got a den and then go in there and find the kittens, mark the kittens, give them pit tags and that sort of thing. So over the years, we've been to 45 different bobcat dens. And so I'll share a little bit about kind of what we see with bobcat dens. So typically our cats will have their dens away from people, no surprise. So if they can find a larger undeveloped area, that's probably where these dens are going to be. But female bobcats don't really create a den. They don't dig a hole. They don't do anything like that. So a lot of times these dens are, we've had them literally just under a palm frond, right, in the pine straw. There might be a little area where she's moved the pine straw, where she's been laying down with the kittens, but she really doesn't do anything. So the den is it tends to be in cover. It almost always has overhead cover to protect the kittens from aerial predators. And then they tend to be located just like where they like to be during the day, in the secondary dunes and the edges of the marsh. And another thing we found that we didn't know we were going to figure out was that these females move these den sites a fair amount. We don't know if it's because they're being disturbed by people walking through it or something else happens. But they will move their den site 4 or 5 times in the first month or two typically. And obviously when she's doing that, she's picking the kittens up by the nape of the neck and carrying them to the new location until they get big enough to follow her. So can't talk about bobcat kittens without a video, right? So there you go. Yeah, they're calling for mom, so we quickly got them back in the den. All right, so we kind of went through the data and some of what we do with it, but kind of where do we go from there? It's great data, it's neat to look at, but how can we actually put it into practice and help us on Kiawah? So what we did is we divided, and we did this 15 years ago, we divided the island up into 5 zones, which we called Bobcat Management Units. And each of those Bobcat Management Units was about the size of an adult male home range. And so the idea was if we could maintain enough cover, food, hiding places for these cats in each of these Bobcat Management Units, then we'd be pretty good across the island, right? Because if you've got one adult male that's got everything he needs, you're going to have some females as well. So once we had set that up, then we went back and looked at the data. And so what we were trying to figure out, and we called them IBAs or important bobcat areas, was basically what parts of the island are really critical, like super important for these bobcats. And if they went away, it would probably be an issue. And so we did that by looking at the data. We used den sites because obviously these den sites, they need to have a lot of cover and a lot of food for these cats. And so we identified these IBAs all across the island, and then we looked at each one and we said, okay, who owns it? What condition is it in? What can we do to enhance it? Can we preserve it? That sort of thing. And so that's kind of how the data starts to get to the management phase when we're actually trying to put it in place to help bobcats. So just I'm going to quickly summarize, kind of what we've learned from the GPS data, and then I'm going to talk spend a little bit of time about where we are now with bobcats at Kiawah. Things have changed for us in the last few years. So I know I've probably said all this, but just to kind of go over it one more time. So during the day, bobcats are almost always in scrub shrub habitat. That's usually on the marsh edge or in the dunes. They don't move much during the day. They're pretty much going to stay in that cover during the day. And then at night, they're going to leave these areas of dense cover, and they're going to forage along road corridors and in backyards, front yards, in between houses and that sort of thing. And then small patches of good cover can be really critical for bobcats. So even little tiny patches that might be an acre or two. We've got one area that's near the Sanctuary Hotel. It's about 3 acres in size. It's a freshwater wetland. And we had a male one year, right, who lives on 1,500 acres. And he spent every other day in that 3-acre patch of cover during the day. It was a great patch. No one ever went into it. Great cover there. And then obviously he was in a good area to feed at night. All right, so bobcats are doing great at Kiawah. Everybody loves them. We've got plenty of them until we don't. And so our population is declining now. We've found 8 dead bobcats in the last 2 years. During our trapping last year in 2019, we did not catch a single juvenile bobcat, which is very unusual. We normally catch 8 to 10 cats when we trap, and usually half of those will be juveniles. This past year, we didn't catch any. So that's an anomaly for sure. And then our residents are reporting seeing less bobcats. And we talked at the beginning about how important bobcats are at controlling our deer numbers. So we're perceiving a decline in the bobcat population. So I promised you we'd come back to this graph. So here we are. I'm ready to reveal the last 4 years of numbers. Anybody want to guess? Think they're going to go up? Yeah.
Wow.
Through the roof in the last 4 years. And so as I said, right, there's no hunting on Kiawah. We're not controlling our deer numbers. We've been fortunate enough that bobcats have done that for us for the last 15 years, and now they're not. And maybe it's just a blip in bobcat numbers, and they'll come back up. We're not really sure. So we'll move on past that. And obviously, I said our numbers are down. So what are the reasons for that? I told you that vehicle collisions were a big cause of mortality for our cats historically, and that's still an issue. We still have a few hit by cars. We thought maybe loss of habitat, but we're really not seeing a whole lot of change in the home range size of bobcats and that sort of thing that would suggest that the habitat is not as good anymore. Maybe it's increased human disturbance, more people, disease, something else. Well, we didn't know until a couple of days ago, or about a week and a half ago. And we still don't know 100% sure that this is the reason, but we know that it is very, very likely the reason. And that is rat poison. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I don't know how many folks are familiar with this. I wasn't that familiar with it, even as a biologist. The potential secondary effects of the use of certain types of rodenticides, but so I'll just give you just a quick kind of rundown on that. So second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, and I'm going to call them SGAs from here on out. We can call them rat poison too. But they basically work by basically messing up the body's recycling of vitamin K. And so something that an infected rodent basically bleeds to death. But it takes 3 to 7 days for them to die. And so we know this because one of our collared cats died on August 2nd. And while we've had a number of cats die, we hadn't found one that was in a condition that we could get tested by a laboratory. So this one we were able to do that. And as I said, we just got the results about a week ago. And what they found 5 different rodenticides in her system, 4 of them at toxic levels. And so just a little more on these I'm going to call them SGAs from here on out. But they're kind of a new thing. They came about maybe 15, 20 years ago. Before that we were using FGAs, first generation anticoagulants. So these are things like warfarin, which was in decon back in the day, which probably everybody used for rodent control. And a lot of folks actually take warfarin to help thin their blood. It's a blood thinner. And so those are not near as toxic as the new ones that are out now. And the other issue with these SGAs is that they don't kill the rat or mouse immediately. So it takes 3 to 7 days. And during that time, they keep eating the bait. And so that while they can get enough to kill them in a couple of bites, well, they're going to keep eating it because they've got free access to the bait. And so they build up these super lethal concentrations of this poison, and then any predator that eats them is obviously going to be consuming that as well. So the other problem with SGAs, not only are they much more toxic than the old stuff, but they last a long time in the body. And so they can stay inside the body of a bobcat, for example, for up to a year. And so with the FGAs, it was a month, and then it would break down and leave the body. So with these SGAs, if you eat a little bit this month, the next month, right, you're accumulating this toxic level over time. And so that's what happened with this bobcat. And so we actually just put together this little public relations thing that we sent out to our residents, just kind of detailing, how this happens. And, most of these, actually, these SGAs, you can't buy them as, the public cannot buy these things. They can only be put out by a licensed pesticide applicator. And so what's going on in most of these cases is a homeowner perceives a rat issue or actually has a rat issue, calls a pest control company and says, fix it. And so what does he do? Well, the easiest thing is to put out these rat boxes, which are typically black in color. They got holes in them. They put the bait inside. They put them all around a structure. I don't know if you have them out here. Hopefully not, but probably. And then what happens is anything can go in there. Rodents, any sort of rodent, gray squirrels, rats, mice, and then ultimately they get eaten by other things, either after they're dead or when they're dying and lethargic. And then that builds up and obviously to something like a bobcat, which is not only eating the rodents, but is also conceivably eating raccoons. We even had them eat foxes at Kiawah, as well as raptors and that sort of thing. So they can really accumulate a really high level of these things. And so the 4 to really worry about, these 4 second-generation anticoagulants, I've got them listed here. So if anyone is using any sort of a rodenticide, just check the active ingredient. If it's one of these 4, I'd encourage you not to use it. There are plenty of other alternatives that work if you've got an actual rodent problem. In a lot of cases, there may be other steps that you could take, and I've got a slide on that I'm not going to show at this point, but if you want a little more information about that, I can certainly share it later. So now we're kind of coming to the end. So, okay, we've got an issue going on with our cats now. Well, how do we protect them? They're an iconic species. People love them. Well, step 1 is get rid of these second-generation anticoagulants. So we're working on that, both voluntarily, and we may end up passing an ordinance to ban the use of these things on the island. And independent of that, we got to keep doing, obviously, the things that we were doing all along. That's protecting our vital bobcat habitat, following our management guidelines, protecting these IBAs, keeping invasive species out, especially of our freshwater wetlands. We've got some issues with tallow trees, so we got to keep controlling those. And then one of our newer programs, kind of geared to create more bobcat habitat, we call Grow Native. And it's just a big push to get native plants into yards. So Kiawah is already pretty good about that, at least about having fairly dense cover in yards, but a lot of times it's not native. And so for a lot of reasons other than just bobcats, we've got a big push now to get native plants back into yards and common areas. And then obviously we need to continue to monitor and research cats, because if we weren't doing all this work, we wouldn't know we had a problem right now, right? And with that, I will take any questions.
Jim, that was awesome. That was a great talk. Okay, I'm sure we have time for some questions if people have some.
Yeah, so I'm just curious, so we've got 3,000 acres of uplands here.
Yep.
Would you expect we have 2 dominant males on Spring Island?
Probably.
Okay.
It could be 1. I mean, it depends.
And how many breeding females would you expect?
2 or 3.
Okay.
Probably. Then you're going to have some, juveniles around. I mean, you could easily have, population of 5 to 10, probably.
Brock, the question.
The question was, we have feral cats on the island as well. Do bobcats crossbreed, or they stick to one?
Yeah, so Kiawah, we don't have many feral cats. If folks have cats, they keep them inside. But no, they're not going to interbreed with the domestic cat. They might chase and consume a domestic cat from time to time. Yeah, and I think that does happen though. At Kiawah, we've never had a reported issue of a bobcat eating a pet of any sort. So that's dog, cat. We've never had that issue. Yes.
What's the life expectancy of a bobcat in the wild?
Good question. It depends on where they are.
Repeat the question.
Life expectancy of a bobcat in the wild. So I would say low country South Carolina, out in the middle of nowhere, 2 or 3 years, 4 years maybe. A place like, you've got some hunting pressure on bobcats, there's some trapping pressure, but in an area like Kiawah, most of our we've had cats live 10 or 11 years. But we only know that because we obviously had caught them at some point to know how old they were. But somewhere 4 to 5 years probably outside of a kind of protected area. Yes, ma'am.
So if you have a max number of cats on the island and they have kittens, they go and they travel off?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the question is, right, if you've already kind of got your maximum capacity of cats on the island, and then all your females have kittens, well, what happens to the kittens? Well, obviously, we lose a few cats every year to mortality, even before this whole rat poison thing. So numbers are changing a little bit, so they can kind of fill those gaps. Females tend to stay home, and so I think that, we've never had a juvenile female leave the island, but our juvenile males are a different story. The majority of the time they leave the island. So our juvenile males are going out to find a territory somewhere else because there's no room for them at Kiawah.
To Tony, do we tag our bobcats?
We do not. So we're seeing more bobcats than we did historically. So for a while there, we just every now and then see one. Lately, I think part of this is more people have camera traps and things like that, but we have definitely seen more bobcats than we did historically. So we think our numbers are coming back up, but that's just a guess because we're not monitoring with radio telemetry or tagging or anything. That's something we could look into.
The black boxes you were talking about, I see those over at our river house. What are we using?
Yeah, that's the first thing that I thought of. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. And I think that's what we all can do because I honestly, I didn't know that. I mean, I knew it was a problem with raptors, but I didn't even think about bobcats. I should have.
I mean, I'm in the same boat, right? I mean, I've seen these black boxes on Kiawah for a long. I mean, and a lot of times they're around. Residential buildings, but also typically more commercial buildings, restaurants, clubhouses, parking lots. I see, at least at Kiawah is where I see them. So, and there could be a different rodenticide being used in those bait stations, but normally, at least my experience is the pest control guys are going to, right, if this will kill a rat pretty well this will kill them a lot, we're going to kill them a lot, right, even though.
But I think that's the kind of thing we can look into and, insist that they use the safer.
And there's plenty of stuff out there that's safer.
I may have misunderstood your numbers, but I think you said that Kiawah has 5,000 acres that are countable, that aren't marshland. Mm-hmm. And we consider ourselves 3,000 acres, but your population is much larger than ours. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I often have a slide in my talk that talks about how dense the population of bobcats is at Kiawah. I typically say that we've got about twice the normal density of bobcats you would find on the mainland. So they are, while Kiawah is a developed community, the reason why we're set up so well for bobcats, number one, we got plenty of deer, and so they had a lot to eat, not to mention rats and mice. But Kiawah is a long, skinny island. And so on the front side of Kiawah, right, we've got 10 miles of great bobcat habitat in our dunes. And on the back side, we've got probably 50 miles of marsh edge that has great scrub shrub habitat. Mm-hmm. So there's nowhere on Kiawah you can't go where you're pretty close to really good bobcat habitat. And so it just allows a lot more cats to pack in there. There's a lot of food and a lot of cover.
Guys, thank you so much for coming out tonight. Jim, thank you.
Sure. Yeah.